Hello everyone, welcome to my channel SW Metro official channel.
Kody Brown, appearing increasingly fragmented, volatile, and isolated. The hypothetical scenario of Kody Brown being hospitalized for a mental health crisis would not be a sudden, shocking event but rather the logical, tragic culmination of years of observable decline, a breaking point born from a perfect storm of self-inflicted polygamous pressures, profound personal loss, and a corrosive, exclusive relationship with his fourth wife, Robyn, whose proclaimed role as a peacemaker has, in effect, become the primary reason for his psychological fracture. To understand the gravity of such a hospitalization, one must first trace the erosion of Kody's identity, which is inextricably linked to his role as the patriarch of a large, thriving family. His sense of self-worth was always derived from being the sun around which his wives and children orbited. His authority, his jokes, his presence were the gravitational force holding the complex celestial system of his household together. The gradual but decisive rejection of this structure by three of his wives, Mary's emotional departure, Christine's physical and emotional secession, and Janelle's stoic, financial independence, has not merely been a series of marital breakdowns. For Kody, it has been a systematic annihilation of his core identity. Each wife who leaves does not just take herself and her children, she dismantles a piece of his kingdom, invalidating the very principle upon which he built his entire life. This is not a simple matter of heartbreak, it is an existential crisis. The man who once boasted of a big picture now finds the canvas ripped to shreds, and he is left staring at the emptiness, forced to confront the terrifying possibility that the grand design he believed in was perhaps a monument to his own ego, now abandoned by the very people he was meant to lead. This level of catastrophic personal and professional failure would be destabilizing for any individual, but for a man whose narcissistic supply was directly fed by the adherents of his family, it is a psychological death sentence, creating a foundation of shame, rage, and profound confusion ripe for a mental health collapse. However, this collapse would not have been achieved without the singular influence of Robyn Brown. Positioned from the beginning as the young, new love who would rejuvenate the family, Robyn's role has subtly and profoundly mutated into that of a monogamous wife in a polygamous shell. Her stated reason for everything, from the move to Flagstaff to the strict COVID-19 protocols that became the final wedge between Kody and his other families, has always been framed as the well-being of the family. Yet, in practice, her actions have consistently prioritized the well-being of her family unit with Kody, creating a safe, insular bubble where he receives unwavering loyalty and affirmation. This dynamic is the key to understanding his breakdown. Robyn has become Kody's sole emotional validator, his only mirror, and the feedback loop they have created is toxic and delusional. She validates his grievances against his other wives, frames their reasonable demands for time and attention as attacks on his authority, and reinforces his perception of himself as a victim of a rebellious faction rather than the architect of his own downfall. By constantly affirming his distorted reality, she has severed his connection to the moderating influences and grounded perspectives that Janelle or Christine might have once offered. He is no longer living in a plural marriage with checks and balances, he is trapped in a feedback loop of his own resentment, expertly echoed and amplified by Robyn. Her reason is therefore not malice, but a desperate, self-serving codependency. She needs him to need her exclusively, and in ensuring that, she has isolated him from every other source of support, love, and reality, leaving him psychologically brittle and entirely dependent on her narrative. When that narrative is challenged by the outside world, by a son who refuses to comply, a wife who moves out, or a television audience that sees through the facade, Kody has no coping mechanisms left, only a raw, unmediated fury and despair that could easily spiral into a crisis requiring professional intervention. The specific trigger for a hospitalization would likely be the final, irrevocable loss of one of the last pillars of his former identity. A physical altercation with one of his estranged sons, perhaps over the treatment of their mother, leaving Kody not just angry but shattered by the realization that his own children view him as a villain. Or the sale of the Coyote Pass property, the last symbolic vestige of his dream to unite his family on one compound, a dream now sold for scrap to divide assets in a divorce. In this state of crisis, Robyn's role would reach its tragic apex. Her reason would shift from reinforcing his grievances to managing the fallout, but her methods would be the same, control and isolation. She would likely be the one to call for help, not out of a place of calm strength, but from a panicked realization that the man she has curated and depended upon is fundamentally broken and that she alone cannot contain the damage. She would speak to doctors in her victimized, breathy tone, explaining how the cruelty of the other wives and the disrespect of the children have driven her poor, devoted husband to this breaking point, further entrenching the narrative that absolves Kody, and by extension, herself, of all accountability. She would become the grieving gatekeeper, controlling access to him, filtering information, and ensuring that the story remains one of a persecuted patriarch rather than a man succumbing to the consequences of his own failed leadership and toxic favoritism. In the end, a mental health hospitalization for Kody Brown would be the ultimate testament to the failure of the principle he claimed to champion. Plural marriage, in its ideal form, is supposed to provide a robust support network, a diversity of perspectives, and a shared burden that makes individuals stronger. Kody, guided by Robyn's influence, inverted this completely. He and Robyn created a monogamous dyad that leached energy and loyalty from the other relationships until the entire system hemorrhaged and died. His mind, therefore, would not be breaking under the strain of polygamy, but under the strain of its absence, an absence he and his favorite wife engineered. The man hospitalized would be a ghost of the exuberant, if often foolish, father we once saw, replaced by a hollowed-out figure drowning in bitterness, abandoned by the family he thought he ruled, and utterly dependent on the one woman whose love was so exclusive it cost him everyone else. Robyn's reason, her constant, whispering insistence that they were the true victims, the last loyal ones standing against a world of disloyalty, would be found written not in the family mission statement, but on the intake forms of a psychiatric ward. It is the final, heartbreaking irony. The wife who claimed to want nothing more than the whole family together would, through the very act of insisting on being first, last, and always the only one who mattered, become the primary reason her husband ended up utterly, tragically, and completely alone. Kody Brown hospitalized with mental illness, and Robyn's reason. For years, Sister Wives has pulled audiences into the chaotic, tangled web of the Brown family. And while the show often spotlighted the dynamics between Kody Brown and his 4 wives, what has slowly and tragically unfolded in recent years is not simply about marriages crumbling or properties being sold, but about the human toll of emotional implosions, fractured trust, betrayal, jealousy, financial burdens, and overwhelming responsibility, and that is why the news that Kody Brown has been hospitalized with mental illness, reportedly a culmination of long-standing struggles with depression, paranoia, anxiety, and unprocessed rage, feels less like a shocking twist and more like the heartbreaking end of a story that has been building for over a decade on screen, and when sources point to Robyn Brown, the last wife standing, as the central figure and the reason behind this crisis, it sparks not only a storm of speculation but also deep questions about the burdens placed on one man. Trying to hold together a collapsing polygamous dream, the role Robyn played as his anchor or his downfall, and whether Kody was ever truly equipped to handle the crushing weight of multiple wives, more than a dozen children, religious expectations, financial ruin, and his own untreated emotional turmoil that began long before Sister Wives ever aired, but was amplified 100-fold once reality TV cameras locked him into a public persona that demanded he perform leadership, charm, and control. Even as his personal life spun further and further out of his grasp, and in looking back at the roots of his breakdown, one can trace clear threads: the implosion of his marriages with Mary, Christine, and Janelle, his estrangement from many of his children, the family's financial collapse after years of buying properties they could not afford, the devastating emotional toll of Garrison Brown's tragic death, and the endless criticism from fans and media that painted him alternately as a narcissist, an authoritarian, or a clueless patriarch, leaving very little room for Kody to admit vulnerability, seek genuine therapy, or break free of the role that both his religion and TLC had cast him in, which was the strong husband and father holding it all together, and yet behind closed doors, as reported by insiders, he was unraveling, with fits of anger, long spells of silence, paranoid suspicions that the ex-wives were plotting against him, fears that TLC would cancel the show and take away the last stream of income keeping him and Robyn afloat, and crushing guilt that his dream of unity had not only failed but had left his family members bitterly divided and estranged from one another. And in this storm, Robyn's role becomes complicated, because while the public often paints her as manipulative, selfish, and jealous, some accounts suggest that Robyn was the only wife who consistently sat by Kody's side, listening to his endless rants, absorbing his tears, encouraging him to keep fighting, and trying desperately to manage his moods and his spirals, but that constant caretaking became, over the years, its own toxic cycle, because instead of pushing him toward professional help, Robyn reportedly enabled him, feeding his paranoia by reinforcing the idea that Christine, Janelle, and Mary had betrayed him, validating his fears that his children were poisoned against him, and urging him to fight to keep control over Coyote Pass, the property that became the symbolic battlefield of all their resentments. And so while Robyn might have been well-intentioned in her desire to protect Kody, in reality she was isolating him further from the family members who might have balanced his perspective, and thus when his mental health finally crumbled to the point of requiring hospitalization, it became clear that the reason was not a single betrayal or a single financial loss but rather the